So, picking back up on the second half of our section on social dilemmas and collective action. So, some updates and reminders. Um, Outline 13, activity 6, and now activity 7 are now in the process of being graded. They will be graded by the end of this week. I'm going to be grading like as fast and with as much diligence as possible. So when I say the end of this week, that might be Friday, that might be Sunday. But the goal is to get everything graded and all of your grades up to date going into next week so that during Thanksgiving break, there is no question in terms of where you stand in the class. You know what has to be submitted, what your grade is. So again, if you can still submit your extra credit until November 21st. That's when I will go over everything. Once everything has been submitted, because I don't want to miss anything, you can submit multiple things to the same Dropbox. And your activity 8, again, that is optional. If you, at the end of this week, next week, you look at your grade and everything is up to date and you are happy with where your grade is, then you are done. You're finished with this class. Worry about your other classes, your other finals, your other projects. You are completely finished. If not, if you're concerned about some of your assignments, then you can complete activity 8 to replace your lowest activity grade. And so that one's more self-guided. There's a reading, there's a few videos, and there will be an activity. And again, that will replace your lowest activity grade. I will just go ahead and have that published where it's available to you after this week so that you have plenty of time to complete it. You'll have Thanksgiving break, you'll have that next week, and you should have plenty of time to go over the readings, to look at the videos, and complete that activity if you would like to replace your lowest activity grade. For those of you who have a few missing assignments, please reach out to me so that we can discuss a resolution moving forward. I know this semester has been really tough on you all. There's a lot going on in the world right now, a pandemic being the most prominent concern as of this moment, but there's a lot of things going on right now, and I know it's been really difficult for you all, and I want to make sure that you have as much support as is needed. And don't be afraid to reach out to me and communicate with me on what's going on, and we can discuss some potential solutions and resolutions to any of your concerns. Your quiz 7 is due Friday at 11:59 p.m. And like your last quiz, I went ahead and made it so that you have 2 chances to complete the quiz. That seemed to be something that was very helpful for many of you. And also, why not? It's nearing the end of the semester. There's so much going on right now. Why not? So you have 2 opportunities to complete the quiz, which again is due Friday. Make sure to watch the supplementary videos and complete the assigned reading for this week. Which again, they do a few different things, and unless you really want to, you can go over the methods section, but I'm not really sure it's particularly necessary for the purposes of this reading. But just please make sure to read that and complete the quiz. But other than that, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please let me know as we, like I said, head into the end of the semester. And this Wednesday will be the final day we meet in person. So, moving on. So, covering social dilemmas, which is something we've been discussing again in this particular section. We're going to get into what those look like. And Wednesday, we're going to get into some more specific examples as well as potential solutions that have been discussed. But today, so when we're looking at social dilemmas, or rather the study of social dilemmas in particular, is the study of this tension between individual and collective rationality. So in a social dilemma, individuality, or rather individual, like reasonable behavior, so something that's rational, that's in your best self-interest, can often lead to a situation in which everyone is worse off. And so that's what we're discussing today. So, defining social dilemmas. Many of the most challenging problems we face, from the interpersonal to the international even, are at their core social dilemmas. And like we've discussed, kind of those central concerns of sociology and social psychology are something we discussed last week. Those major questions. I mean, we're not so much concerned with maybe why people deviate, although that can be, a major area of study. We're all essentially concerned with, why do people conform? Why do people cooperate? Why do people behave in ways that defy their own self-interest? And that's not necessarily always a bad thing, because it can lead to like the collective interest. Um, and so that's essentially what we're concerned about when we're discussing social dilemmas. So as individuals, we are each better off when we make use of like a public resource, for example, such as like public television. And we don't necessarily make any major contributions to its production and maintenance and all of that. But if everyone acted on this conclusion, the public resource would not be provided and we would all suffer. So when you think of, I don't know, something like PBS, which is, if you have a little satellite and a television, you can pretty much pick up PBS and local news stations. Which again, we'll discuss some of the caveats to these issues and some of the ways in which they're insufficient. But regardless, so if we think of something like PBS, and at the end of everything, they always say, they give a thank you to contributors like you. So people who are helping to maintain and provide that public resource that benefits everyone, regardless of not whether or not we contribute. So when we're defining social dilemmas, they are the situation in which this individual rationality leads to collective irrationality. So if all of us are behaving in a rational way, which is, maybe in our own self-interest, which is just benefiting from this public resource, let's say PBS, and nobody does anything to, contribute to that maintenance. They're just looking out for themselves. Hey, this is a benefit to me, and I don't want to, expend any of my resources to maintain it because perhaps others will. Um, and so it leads to this collective irrationality, in the sense of, as a collective, now nobody can benefit from that resource, meaning individually reasonable behavior leads to a situation in which everyone is worse off than they would have been otherwise. So, getting into modeling social dilemmas, three really important terms that I want you to think about as we move through this, in terms of what's a deficient equilibrium, what's an equilibrium, and what are some dominating strategies that you notice. So, all social dilemmas are marked by at least one deficient equilibrium, meaning there's at least one other outcome in which everyone is better off. And all social dilemmas have at least one. And they're deficient in that, again, there's this at least one other outcome in which everyone is better off. So, looking at that quadrant that we looked at for the prisoner's dilemma, for example, one of those outcomes is best for everyone. That everyone benefits the most, specifically from like cooperating. And then you have an equilibrium, and it is an equilibrium in that no one has an incentive to change their behavior. So, like, a group of people facing a social dilemma may completely understand the situation, and they may even appreciate how each of their actions contribute to a disastrous outcome, and still be unable to do anything about it. So, despite the fact that, we're relatively rational, we might even be able to see our own contribution and recognize how it, benefited us in the moment, but ended up hurting everyone in the end. Perhaps there's not much that can be done. So when we're thinking of an equilibrium, it's that there's really no incentive. So again, thinking of these things, I want you to kind of notice as we move through this particular lecture. In what areas do you notice a deficient equilibrium? What areas do you notice an equilibrium? And where do you see these dominating strategies? And dominating strategies yield the best outcome for an individual, regardless of what anyone else does. So, meaning that it's not really dependent on what anyone else does, it's simply what benefits the other person. It's wholly dependent just on their own decisions alone and not what anyone else chooses to do. And so, again, like we've discussed, it's something that's rational, but it can be harmful to everyone else in terms of collective benefit. And so the most severe social dilemmas are also characterized by a dominating strategy that often leads to a deficient equilibrium, which again is this, there's at least one other outcome in which everyone is better off. In a dominating strategy, um, it's rather I would say like the most compelling and even like perverse feature of these dilemmas is that there's no ambiguity about what one should do to benefit oneself. But often there's this ambiguity in terms of like what the other person might do. And so at the same time, while there's no ambiguity about what one should do to benefit oneself, at least seemingly, um, all may be hurt if we follow this rational decision, so to speak. However, not all social dilemmas involve dominating strategies, as we will discuss, and I want you to kind of keep an eye out for these. So, one thing that's important to note is in the literature on social dilemmas, it's kind of evolved around these three metaphorical stories that have assumed what they would call like mythic proportions. And these stories, which are the prisoner's dilemma, the problem of providing public goods, and the tragedy of the commons, these stories, these metaphors, have served as catalysts facilitating and structuring research, but they've also served as blinders. And the hegemony of these models has at times led researchers, or worse, even policymakers, because these things have shaped policy in many ways. It's led them to believe mistakenly that these metaphors capture the whole range of social dilemmas or accurately model all empirical social dilemmas, that they fit perfectly to the real world. But that's, not the case. That's not the purpose of metaphors. Metaphors exist to communicate meaning, but they're not meant to be applied, thoroughly to every single potential situation. They're just communicating these broad ideas through specific examples. And so they're not meant to be applied to every situation or like universally true across all situations, time, and context. And so we will discuss each of these models and their limitations, as well as other models of social dilemmas and that have, traditionally maybe even received more or less attention. And so what's important to note is that in categorizing social dilemmas, there are two types. One is involving two actors, so dyadic or two-person dilemmas, and then those involving multiple actors. So those can be, we'll discuss them as multiple person dilemmas, but they're often called in-person dilemmas, like the letter N. And so, like in research, like if your sample is, you have an N of 100, so you surveyed like 100 people, your N is 100. So these dilemmas could be an N of 3. So it would be like a three-person dilemma. It could be an N of 100, a 100-person dilemma. The N is just kind of a placeholder for like multiple, more than two people. So an in-person dilemma. But at any rate, these three metaphors, and we've discussed one of them throughout multiple sections. So that's the prisoner's dilemma. So it's when two individuals acting in their own self interest do not produce the optimal outcome, but when both parties choose to protect themselves at the expense of the other participant. And so the best outcome for them is to cooperate. However, there is ambiguity because you don't know what your partner is going to do. You don't know if your partner is going to, sell you out, or if your partner is going to cooperate and not. And the best outcome tends to be when both people cooperate. And that's taking it. And so you can say, okay, well, that isn't the best outcome, because the best outcome is when, you don't do anything and you let your partner, in this particular metaphor, this example, you let your partner confess and you don't say anything. That's the best outcome for you. And that's true. That's rational. But the point being is you can't account for what the other person's going to do because you don't know. You probably do not have trust in them enough, or in the situation enough, to know how they're going to react. So ultimately, it's best if you both cooperate and both of you, refuse to confess, or whatever the case is. And so then we have a public good dilemma. And so that's the providing public goods. And it's where the whole group can benefit if some of the members give something for the common good, but individuals benefit from what we call free riding if enough others contribute. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But we'll talk about some of the issues with that. So, public goods, I use the example here of like a food co op. And so there's a show called Broad City. It's really funny, but they live in New York City and they're working at a food co-op, and or they're part of a food co-op. And what's really great is that they live in New York City. They live in an area where they don't typically have a lot of access to fresh produce that's affordable. And so they join this food co op. And what you have to do is, because everybody owns it, it's like community owned, is that everyone has to contribute. Everyone has to contribute some amount of time to maintaining the food co op so that everybody can benefit. It looks just like a grocery store, basically. And so each person, let's say they have to contribute 4 hours a month to the food co op. And people, of course, can contribute at different capacities. So some people might, volunteer to contribute extra. Some people might have, certain abilities that allow them to contribute more than others. Like if someone's really strong and they can move a lot of the heavy stuff, and so they're very valuable. Maybe someone's really good at organizing and categorizing things, and so they do a really nice job of organizing the store and making sure everything is accounted for, and so that makes them very valuable. And some others, the best they can contribute, they can come in and sweep, and their skills aren't really something that can be applied within that particular context. So they just come in and they contribute the best that they can. That may be, working the register, cleaning up, whatever the case may be. So again, some people contribute at very high levels and some contribute very little. In this particular case is a television show. Uh, one of the women, she hadn't worked her hours and she'd put it off to the very last minute. Something came up and she couldn't do it. So she asked her friend to go and do her hours for her and work at the food co-op. And so the people who run the food co-op found out, and that's something that is strictly prohibited. Everyone has to contribute to maintain this. And so, because they're very concerned with the free rider problem, and so they don't want that. It's one thing. You're going to have some free riders regardless. And again, that's not necessarily something that is of everyone's own volition. People can contribute at different levels, and some people don't have the capacity to contribute very much to the particular system. But it reaches a point to where you can only have so many, because even though you have people who contribute extra to compensate for those who can't contribute very much, there's kind of like this point at which you can only have so many who are contributing extra and so many who are not contributing a lot in order to maintain the resource at an appropriate level for everyone. So at any rate, the people who run the food co-op found out and banned them both from all food co-ops in the city, which they were really upset about. But right, they weren't contributing, they weren't necessarily following the rules, and so they were banned from the food co-op because the free rider problem was something that was a concern, because it's something that the whole group benefits from if most of the people are contributing and being honest, right? And so then finally you have the tragedy of the commons. And so the metaphor, the story here is of sheep herders. And you can think of it as like sheep or cattle. And to me, I feel like this metaphor could be adapted to something that might be more relevant or relatable, like maybe like a dog park or something, but we'll just go with the original one. So, like, there's this common kind of grazing area for people with their sheep or their cattle. And, let's say let's say there's a particular carrying capacity, and, 100, there's a community of 150 people, and those who are sheep and cattle, have sheep and cattle, they each can have an hour a day to come and let their animals graze in this kind of common area, this common pasture. But if some people start to take advantage of that and take more than their allotted hour, then over time nobody benefits because the resource is depleted. And so the tragedy of the commons, this dilemma, is when individual users acting according to their own self-interest behave contrary to the common good of all users by depleting a shared resource through their own collective action. And so again, when we're talking about these social dilemmas, there being two types: the two-person dilemma and the in-person or multiple person dilemma. And so I want you to keep, be looking for the deficient equilibrium, the dominating strategies, as well as kind of thinking about these three different metaphors and how they are great in terms of communicating information, but insufficient when applied to, or could be misleading to some extent when applied to real world issues and concerns, which is something we'll delve into more in the next lecture. So, starting off with two-person dilemmas. So again, like the prisoner's dilemma is a two-person dilemma. Um, so for example, like if I buy something through the mail, I may be tempted to not send money. Let's pretend online shopping isn't necessarily a thing, but let's say that I could be tempted to not send a check through the mail, some sort of payment. And the other person might be tempted to not send the goods. So if we both defect, we each are worse off than if we had cooperated and completed this exchange in a fair way. So what defines the prisoner's dilemma in particular is the relative value of the four outcomes. So the best possible outcome is defecting while one's partner cooperates. But again, that may be rational, that may be in your best self interest. But because there's this ambiguity and you can't account for what your partner is going to do, the next best outcome is mutual cooperation. And that's something that you can be more certain about. There's less risk, and there's a little bit less uncertainty as long as you both go in, okay, we're both going to cooperate because I don't know what the other person's going to do. And then following that, it's mutual defection, with the worst outcome being the case in which one cooperates while the other partner defects. Thus, you have the prisoner's dilemma. So getting into some other two-person dilemmas, first you have what is called an assurance game. And so these are situations in which the best choice is the choice the other person makes. And so a common misunderstanding is that the assurance game presents no dilemma at all and leads inevitably to mutual cooperation. In fact, cooperation is not a dominating strategy, like we discussed, but if the person believes the partner will defect, the best the person can do is defect as well. So, in other words, the assurance game has two equilibria: mutual cooperation, which is the best option, as well as mutual defection, which is a deficient equilibrium. So the problem with an assurance game is that is figuring out what the other player will do. So, for example, which side of the road to drive on. It only works if both actors make the same choice. It doesn't work if they make different choices. So we all have to agree we're all going to drive on the right side of the road. Regardless of which direction you're going, it's going to work out. If we're going in the same direction and someone's, behind you, you're both traveling in the same direction on the same side of the road, there are no issues. However, if you're driving on the road, right, and the other person is coming in the opposite direction, if they're also driving on the right, not an issue. You guys are going to pass each other, everything's fine. But if they're driving on the left and you're driving on the right, you're going to collide. And so the assurance game is the best option is, again, to choose something different, to choose the same thing as the other person, so that you're cooperating with each other in that particular way. That's how you achieve the best outcome in these assurance games, is so that you're choosing the same thing. So one of the issues here with the assurance game is that this doesn't perfectly apply, right? Because as we can see here, And when we kind of map this out, is it says, so, okay, if driver A drives on the right side of the road, and driver uh, B drives on the right side of the road or left side for both of them, it's like this win-win, right? And that that makes sense. But if we're thinking about, okay, well, what if, there's a two-lane road, one person decides to go on the left and one person decides to go on the right, but you're both going in the same direction, that doesn't really present a problem. Um, I mean, I guess if it's like a one-lane road, that's an issue. But it doesn't perfectly apply to this real world situations. But again, it's not supposed to. But if policymakers, for example, are applying this very strictly and almost literally to real world situations, there's going to be a lot of things that aren't accounted for. Because, you know, if we're both driving on different sides of the road, but we're going in the same direction, as long as there's no oncoming cars, it really shouldn't be an issue. So that's kind of a shortcoming there. But for the purpose of this example, right, that's not, we want everyone to be kind of on the same page. But as we can see here, as long as you agree, it's a win-win for everyone by and large. But again, it's inadequate in terms of its our ability to apply it to real world situations. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad metaphor, because it's still conveying kind of the nature of this game and those situations where the really the only outcome where anybody benefits is if we both cooperate. There's really no option, no other option but to cooperate. Otherwise, we're both going to lose. So there's this assurance is that people will typically cooperate because their outcome depends on the other person in terms of their willingness to act in the exact same way, their willingness to cooperate. And this brings us to what's called a game of chicken. And it's exactly as it sounds. So the third game, or the second game, I guess, in terms of this one, uh, is created by switching a different pair of outcomes as the prisoner's dilemma game. So if mutual defection yields um, a worse outcome than unilateral cooperation, we create a game of chicken. And so um, it's, again, self explanatory. So the characteristics of the game of chicken is there are two equilibria. So unilateral defection and unilateral cooperation. And so one person has to give in and cooperate by making a different choice than the other. And this results in a joint benefit. So if you're thinking about, the two cars driving down the road and they're both going down different sides, they're head to head, they're about to collide, somebody has to give in and someone has to swerve. And that's the only way that this is going to turn out well for anyone in the situation. However, the problem is if neither actor chooses to cooperate. And so it's getting people to cooperate because at the same time, there's this incentive not to give in because you want to win. You want to be the one who, prevails in the end. But at the same time, if both people are thinking that way and are steadfast in their, they're resolute in their decision not to cooperate and give in, then nobody wins. But it's, just like the game of chicken, is like somebody has to swerve, somebody has to give in, or nobody wins, and both people are ultimately hurt. So if one person can provide a joint benefit, for example, then it may make no sense for a second person to duplicate this effort. And the problem comes when each person attempts to stare the other down, so to speak, each refusing to budge and hoping the other will give in and cooperate. The key problem in this case is avoiding this kind of the standoff that results in the worst possible outcome. So when we look at it mapped out here, right, if driver A stays straight but driver B swerves, it's a win-lose. But at the same time, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Is that I would call it a win-win personally, because there's a disaster that's been avoided. Um, But, if both people, if they don't cooperate and they still continue going straight and they don't swerve off, you know, to miss each other, they're going to crash. Somebody has to give in and cooperate. Alternatively, within this particular game of chicken, it says that if driver A swerves and driver B swerves, it's a tie. So they both gave in and cooperated, and it's a tie. But again, in terms of the shortcomings of this particular metaphor, if we're going with the driving example, what if they both swerve in the exact same direction, right? Then it's still going to result in a crash ultimately. It's not a perfect metaphor. If both people, concede, if both people cooperate, the outcome can still be negative. So it would, probably actually be more appropriate to say that it's not really a tie. I guess you could call it a tie in terms of, maybe it goes well, maybe it doesn't. It's kind of a toss up. It's not for certain that it's going to end in a collision, but, there's still a possibility. So, whatever it is, you're both going to get the same outcome for better or for worse. But, really the best outcomes here is if one person concedes and one person decides to cooperate ultimately. And so that's kind of the message of this particular metaphor is, again, it can be perfectly applied to real world situations, but it does tell us a lot about, it does a good job of conveying the meaning of these particular situations where the best outcome for everyone is just if one person concedes, to the other, or one group concedes to the other at some point. Otherwise, it's really uncertain what's going to happen. It's a toss up in terms of it could be for better or for worse, but ultimately the best decision is for one person to concede. And then we have multiple person dilemmas, or also known as in-person dilemmas. So there's two different types that we will discuss. The first is known as a social fence. And so that's the individual is faced with an immediate cost that generates a benefit that is shared by all. The individual has an incentive to avoid the cost, but if all avoid this, the cost, each is worse off than if they had managed to scale the fence, so to speak. And these aren't what we'll be referring to them as, but these are how they're often discussed in this particular area of literature. And then the second time is termed as what is called a social trap. So the individual is tempted with an immediate benefit that produces a cost shared by all. If all succumb to the temptation, the outcome is ultimately a collective disaster. So within each of these broad categories lies, one of these metaphors that has driven research in this area, being this provision of public goods or a social fence, and the tragedy of the commons or the social trap. So, first, looking at the public goods dilemmas. So, a public good is a resource from which all may benefit, regardless of whether they have helped provide the good. So, for example, right, I can enjoy watching PBS, whether or not I contribute any time or money to the production of that public good. And likewise, I can enjoy a park in my city or another city, even, regardless of whether or not I'm paying those like municipal taxes or part of the creation or maintenance of that particular park. And public goods are also distinguished by the fact that they are what we call non rival. Meaning that one person's use of the good does not diminish its availability to another person. So like my enjoyment of, PBS doesn't make less of it available to anyone else. However, one of the issues with this is that these things aren't necessarily true. And what we'll discuss in the next one is that some resources can be discussed as if they're a public good, but they can also be discussed as if they are, which we'll get to, a common good. So some other things to note that are imperfect in terms of the public goods dilemma. So thinking of like the food co-op example, Is that right? Like people can still benefit from the public good, whether or not they contribute, although contributing is sometimes strictly enforced, like in the example I gave, or it's not. And it just, relies, there's really no pressure um, there to those who are contributing. Um, they're choosing to contribute and everything is going well. Um, but some things to note is that, again, like they kind of overlap a bit. Um, but one of the most important things about a public good is that they say that they're distinguished by the fact that they're non-rival, in that your use of something doesn't take away or diminish my ability to use that, benefit from that same public good. But that's often not necessarily the case, right? Because if you're using a public park, um, let's say you're using it to have a birthday party, or something, that does influence my ability to use that particular space. So that's just one particular example. If we're using public parks as our location or public good of choice, it does oftentimes influence, my ability to benefit from that. But also, when we think about those who are contributing, is when we look at how it's mapped out here. So, if person A contributes and person B contributes, then both benefit from this well maintained resource. But if person A free rides while person B contributes, then person A benefits from a less, well maintained resource while person B is over contributing, and vice versa. And if neither contribute, if they're both free riding, then both benefit from a poorly maintained resource. And so the issue here, which again we'll discuss more specific examples and some of the issues related to that and some of the considerations, and why this isn't a perfect metaphor in this particular circumstance, or just like something that can be broadly applied to these more specific examples, is so it says like a person, right? Everyone can contribute at different capacities. Some people just, free ride, the term itself kind of sounds negative, but it can also just be people who they just can't contribute a lot to the system, to the creation or maintenance of the public good. For whatever reason. Maybe it's intentional, maybe it's circumstantial. They just simply don't have the capacity to provide a lot. Whereas others, they might provide a ton and have, really no issue with it. But more broadly speaking, um, there's there's a certain point where those who contribute extra can no longer compensate for those who are not contributing at all, or who are contributing very little. And so the problem then becomes, how do you get people to behave altruistically? Because at that point, those who are contributing a lot are working against their own best interest. Um, Oftentimes, like if they're able to contribute a lot, they would be able to exist outside of that particular system, although that's not necessarily the case. But certainly, they're contributing a lot more than they have to, and while others are benefiting, and they're receiving the same benefit, but their costs are much higher. And so at that point, they're working against their own best interest, their own self interest. And so, how do you get people to behave in what we would call an altruistic way because they're behaving against their own self interest? And so, typically, we think of altruism as like doing something good for somebody. And we think, okay, they're not thinking of themselves; they're thinking of somebody else. But at the same time, we often don't think of altruism is like, okay, but that also requires someone to work against their best interest. And sometimes that's good, and sometimes perhaps it isn't. And so, how do you, those who can contribute a lot or who are over contributing, how do you get them to continue doing so? And how do you encourage others to do the same thing? How do you encourage them to be altruistic and work against their own self interest? Well, um, some of the things, and we'll get more into this Wednesday, so in the next lecture, but some of the things that have been discussed is, thinking back to our section on social exchange. So what fosters something like cooperation? Punishment, as we discussed, is something that's quite powerful. It's a powerful social force, is punishment. But keep in mind, it has to be something that is consistent and rather severe, right? It can't be kind of low level. It has to be quite profound in order to uh, garner or incite like this immediate compliance in order for there to be this joint benefit. So punishment is one, but it has to be consistently applied. Um, and, severe isn't necessarily the word I'm looking for, but it has to be something that is will essentially force immediate compliance. So that's one option. Okay, we'll put that right here. And then same within social exchange, because again, that's something that can be applied at these different levels of the social structure. So we'll say that, like, kind of like your exchange partner is this larger group or system. And so, how do you get people to, thinking in terms of like equity within an exchange relationship? How do you, right? You don't want the system to be dependent. So, thinking in terms of power and dependence, those who are free riding may not have other options. They this may be the only place for them to get or access this particular public good, and therefore this particular public good is completely within the hands of those who are contributing, particularly those who are contributing at a high level. If they stopped, the public good um, may not be as plentiful or as available or accessible as it was. So it's completely dependent, right? Then those who are contributing have a lot of power. And that's not necessarily a good thing, but at the same time, how do you get them to stay within that system and contribute? Well, thinking back to trust and cooperation and social exchanges, um, and relationship satisfaction and all of those things, we can think of, okay, well, there would need to be alternatives to contributing to this particular system. But this system would have to offer benefits that are at least comparable to what the alternatives could provide. And so there are some issues with that, but we'll discuss that more. But again, you want there to be alternatives because everyone has to feel like it's like their idea and they're choosing to do this. Um, and so that might be something that is an option. Okay, so we'll put that there. Next, punishment. And the third thing that is often discussed is uniting people under a common identity. And so going back to, the section on identity theory and social identity theory, also when we discussed the Robbers Cave experiment. So, right, what did the boys do when they were separated into groups? Well, they didn't treat the out group very well. There was a lot of hostility and competition for these perceived, this perceived scarcity of resources. But within their in group, right, they were cooperative and protective and this and that. So we can look back to that, and we can also look in terms of identity and social identity. So uniting everyone under this common social identity, so that we see each other as part of the in group. But how that relates to identity theory is that not only is you're seeing others as part of your in group under this broad social identity, but it relates to your own personal identity because you're seeing these members of your in group as an extension of yourself to some degree. And so when we see, others as kind of an extension of ourself, it's related to our personal self, our personal identity, but also those within our in group, our shared social identity. We tend to be more trusting. We tend to show more trustworthy behavior, more altruistic behavior. We want to help those within our group. We want to contribute. And so that's another thing that's discussed is so you have punishment, you have the availability of alternatives, and then you also have a common identity being quite powerful. And again, we'll discuss these in more detail in the next one. But what's important to consider is that, again, these aren't perfect metaphors, and they shouldn't necessarily strictly guide policy, or at least we've seen some issues in the past when these metaphors have been used to guide policy because, again, they're metaphors. They're not meant to be like strictly and thoroughly applied to these very specific circumstances. They're just there to convey this information and kind of the broad nature of each of these, social dilemmas. So, as we'll discuss more Wednesday, there are some things, some moral concerns, some ethical concerns, and some other things to consider in terms of these, public goods and common goods. So finally, we have the commons dilemma. And so that's when individuals acting independently and rationally according to each one's self interest behave contrary to the whole group's long term best interests by depleting some common resource. So this is going back to the tragedy of the commons, or which is, some of the early statements of this basic problem can, you know they're founded in, some of the works and writings of Aristotle, and it's a book now. But the tragedy of the commons specifically is referring to this story of a group of herders having open access again to this common parcel of land, in which they could let their cattle graze. And so it's in each herder's interest to put as many cows as possible onto this land, even if the commons is damaged as a result. The herder receives all the benefits from the additional cows, and the damage to the commons, however, is shared by the entire group. Yet, if all herders make this individually reasonable decision, the commons is completely destroyed and everyone will suffer. Um, so, one thing to note is some considerations here is that for commons dilemmas, the issue is not necessarily the production, function, but the carrying capacity of the commons, which is a function of its, replenishment rate. So, like different areas, like different resource pools, will be renewed at different rates. Like you can think of maybe like, a water, like an aquifer, during a drought period, and how we have to ration our water so that we don't run out, so that we don't deplete the aquifer. You can think about, maybe this particular parcel of land, it can only accommodate 100 cows. And, 100 cows, and let's say, everybody has 1 hour a week to let their cattle graze at this particular area. I don't know. And that's really all it can accommodate. And so, one thing to note here is that there's this subtractability in commons dilemmas, is that they say that your use of this resource diminishes my ability to use this resource. And it's kind of strictly applied, but when we look at this here, if person A and person B cooperate, both benefit from this plentiful resource. If they act in self interested ways, nobody benefits. And something to consider is when it says person A is self interested, whereas person B cooperates, and vice versa, one benefits while the other doesn't benefit. So if, let's say, one person takes 2 hours instead of one, when we say that person B is cooperating, that doesn't mean that they're sticking to their 1 hour. That means that they're compensating for the other person. So because the other person took 2 hours, that means that person B says, okay, well, I don't want to diminish this resource, so I can't take my hour this week. I'm going to give up my hour to compensate for person A's behavior, for them taking 2 hours. Um, and so, with this particular dilemma, what's difficult is that it's not immediately evident. So, if we're looking at water during a drought, for example, it's not immediately evident, right? Because let's say you go over your water allowance, well, your water still works. And so you don't think, oh, we're running out of water, right? There's no cue, there's no immediate incentive to change your behavior. But if we all behave in this, rational way, so to speak, and just benefit ourselves, then it, in the end, harms everyone. And so, in some, public goods dilemmas concern the production of, and, if we're looking at the public goods dilemmas concerns the production of, these joint resources, whereas the commons dilemma involved the use of joint resources. But one thing to note for the commons dilemma in particular is that they say that, okay, your use of it takes away from my use. And why it doesn't perfectly apply is because, okay, so let's say the land has a carrying capacity of 100 cows. And, you know, if we all do our 1 hour a day, and altogether we have 100 cows, I don't know, um, then that's what that can support. And we can all continue to, use our 1 hour, and that's it. And it will always be available. And so, to some extent, in that case, like, you using it does not take away from my ability to use it. I mean, it takes away from my ability to use it more, but for the most part, it doesn't necessarily affect me. I don't have to lose any time, so to speak. But one thing to note is that when we talk about kind of like the exclusivity of these commons is important, because when we're looking at like the carrying capacity, it can only support like 100 cows. What about the other people who would like their cattle to graze on this land? So from the get go, it has to be something that's exclusive to some degree, because it can only support so many people at its greatest carrying capacity. It can only support so many people. So us taking an hour each week, why don't we cut it down to 30 minutes and let 100 other, or other people, increase the cattle to 200? I think is how that would work. Is why don't we lose some of our time so that more people can take from this resource without it being depleted? And you get into a lot of issues there. Like, is that enough? Is that sufficient? And at what point does it come down to where we have the most people who are drawing from this resource, but we're all getting very little benefit? Like, if we cut it down to 5 minutes, it's pretty pointless at that point. Like, sure, yeah, we're not depleting the resource, but nobody's actually benefiting from it, even though we have, so many more people and cattle who are using this resource. It's really not benefiting anyone, because um, we barely have any time. So thinking of like carrying capacity, and it being exclusive, and well, at what point, when we're dividing this resource among us, at what point is it no longer a reward? At what point is it no longer beneficial to anyone, because everyone is benefiting, or so many people are, right? It gets very complicated, which again is something we'll discuss more Wednesday. These are really tough situations, and these are things that we often talk about in sociology and social psychology, but also things that we talk about when we're thinking of, who we're going to choose for, as mayor, or as state representative or president, or whatever the case may be. We can also think who we're going to choose as, I don't know, it doesn't even have to be president of our country. It could be president of a particular group we're a part of. But we're thinking of these things and how they're going to handle these different issues, how we're going to divide resources among us, and what does that entail in terms of cooperation, from different people and different groups of people. And so it gets very difficult. And again, that being the core kind of issue at the heart of social psychology is, why do people cooperate? Why do people conform, when oftentimes it's in their best interest not to? So again, that's something we'll discuss in some more specific details and get more in the nitty gritty of these issues in the next lecture. But other than that, that's it for today, and I hope you have a great week. Thanks.